in the Acts. Another difference, a significant one, is between Luke's portrait of events in the Acts of the Apostles and what we learn from St. Paul's own letters about these same events. And in particular, one event, which was the famous Council of Jerusalem in 49 AD. Now, in the Acts of the Apostles, St. Luke presents Paul as constantly checking back with headquarters, with Peter and James in Jerusalem. And he presents the Council of Jerusalem in 49 AD as a key event, a real milestone in church history, where everyone agrees that the Gentiles don't need to become Jews first to become Christians. They don't need to have circumcision. They can just become a Christian through entry into the church, through baptism. But perhaps we should follow a couple of the kosher dietary rules. Now, most scholars agree that the Council of Jerusalem was an important event in early church history. But in Paul's memory of that event, he takes up to Jerusalem the uncircumcised Titus, has a private meeting with Peter and James, and then they agree, just over a handshake really, that Paul can work with the uncircumcised Gentiles, whereas Peter and James would look after the Jewish people. So just to be aware of that. Now a third thing, let's spend a moment or two looking at the life of St. Paul. Just a brief chronology, so we get a sense of the flow of his life. Paul, Paulos in Greek, means small. It's got nothing to do with his stature. We can't say he was a small guy at all. Paul was a fairly famous surname in the Greek-speaking world. He had a Jewish name, Saul. And Saulos in Greek means, and before it, of course, in Hebrew, asked of God, demanded of God, asked of God. Father Joseph Fitzmyer, one of the great Pauline scholars, thinks that Paul was born as Paul, and he later adopted the Hebrew name Saul as a sign of his wanting to identify as Jewish. He did say in Philippians, I'm of the race of Israel, of the tribe of Benjamin, a Hebrew of Hebrew parentage. He was born, and there's almost a 15-year range of when he was born. The earliest is probably 4 or 5 BC. The latest is 10 AD. As mentioned, he was born in Tarsus, the capital of the Roman province of Cilicia, a melting pot for peoples from the east and from the west, with a big Jewish population. And it's good for us to know that in the Roman Empire of around 60 million people at the time of Paul and of Jesus, around 7% to 10% were actually Jewish. So they were an immensely significant minority. The Jewish people could be 6 million in 60 million. What attracted everybody, especially wealthier and thinking Romans, to Judaism was their sense of the one God. And the Jewish people call them God-fearers or God-lovers. Now, if he was born earlier, 4 or 5 BC, he's an exact contemporary of Jesus. And that's what Father Jerome Murphy O'Connor would say in his Jesus and Paul, a lovely little book that came out 2 years ago. Well, we know he underwent an extraordinary conversion experience somewhere near Damascus. We call it his Damascus experience. It would have happened around 34 AD to 36 AD, very soon after the crucifixion of Jesus. Paul would have been at that stage around 25 at the youngest, 40 if he was born 5 BC. After this experience near Damascus, he went to Arabia for some time before returning to Damascus for a few years. He then visits Jerusalem for a fortnight and goes and retires to Syria and Cilicia, probably staying in his own city of Tarsus for several years, until around 44 AD. Barnabas comes to him in Tarsus and brings him back to Antioch, where he stays for a whole year. And from there, Barnabas and Paul go on mission with their base in Antioch. And this first of the mission experiences is to Cyprus and Galatia. And it lasts for 3 years. At the end of that, in 49 AD, Paul goes to Jerusalem, the so-called Council of Jerusalem. Then there's a second sortie or mission or whatever. And this one is based in Corinth now. And it lasts 2 to 3 years, 50 to 52. It's northern Galatia, Troas, Philippi, Thessalonica, Athens, and his big base, his big time in Corinth, living with Priscilla and Aquila. It's there he writes 1 Thessalonians. He's brought before Gallio by the Jewish people who dislike him, but the charge is dismissed by Gallio and returns to Antioch and spends a year there. So we've got a sense with that, of course, of his going to synagogues, but falling under the dislike, the ire, the anger of some of the Jewish people. Then his third mission, from 54 to 58 AD, is based now in Ephesus, the capital of Asia. He writes there Galatians, Philippians, Philemon, and 1 Corinthians. Then, after the revolt of a silversmith, he leaves for Macedonia, where, through Titus, he learns of the Corinthian reconciliation, so he writes 2 Corinthians. Well, we call it 2 Corinthians. It appears that there are quite a few other letters that are missing. But that's the second one that we have of Paul's letter to the wonderful church at Corinth. After this, he moves and stays 3 months in Achaia, Greece. And during that 3-month stay, he takes up a collection for the poor people in Jerusalem. And he writes this. Father Fitzmyer writes this. It's there that he planned to take the collection to Jerusalem and thus to terminate his evangelization of the whole Eastern Mediterranean world. He wanted then to visit Rome and from there go to Spain and to the Western world. It's during this 3 months in Achaia that he writes our letter, the letter to the Romans. It's late 57 AD or early 58 AD, around that time. He plans to sail to Syria, but because of Jewish plots against him again, he eventually travels overland and spends Passover 58 AD in Philippi, where Luke joins him.